Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webcast today. We have Scott Hendren with us. He is a Senior Instructional Designer at ASCENT and lead author of all things for Creo, for our learning guides with ASCENT. So he's going to give us some updates today from Creo 3.0 to 4.0. So Scott, I'm going to pass things over to you.
Thank you, Corinne. So thanks everyone for joining today. Our training guide for Creo 3 to 4 update covers, UI enhancements, part enhancements, sketcher, assembly, sheet metal, and detailing. I'm going to cover today in this session parts of UI enhancements, parts of the part enhancements, and parts of the sketcher enhancements, so we can kind of squeeze this down into an hour. So I'm going to go through a few slides just to kind of level set on what we're going to cover today, and then I'll actually do a live demo of the software. If at any point I'm speaking too fast, too slow, too loud, not loud enough, please let Corinne know, and I'll try to adjust accordingly. So the first little section we're going to look at is some of the user interface enhancements. So if you start up Creo 4 out of the box, you'll notice a few things right away, some significant, some not significant. On that sort of not so significant scale, there is a new skin to Creo 4, so sort of the shapes of some of the dialog boxes and the colors, this gray on gray scheme, have been updated. Functionally no change there, but just visually a change. That can all be customized, which we do cover in the actual training course. I won't have the time to cover it here today, but good to know that it is customizable. They've done things like added labels to the model tree tabs, updated the in-graphics toolbar a little bit, and changed the look of coordinate systems. Not a functional change, just a visual change. On the more significant side, though, is the ability to run Creo full screen, which we'll take a look at, as well as the addition of the mini toolbar. So we'll take a look at those as we go forward here. So again, just a real quick one, the coordinate systems have updated. Again, a visual change. They've added arrows to the axes of the coordinate systems. Functionally, no different whatsoever, just a visual change. Activating windows. This is actually a change that occurred in Creo 3, but over time, I came to realize that a lot of people actually missed this change, so I thought I would cover it in this course. When you're switching between windows, maybe have a part in one window and a part in another window. In previous releases, when you switched from window to window, you actually had to manually activate a window so that you can work on the model. In Creo 3 and Creo 4, you simply select on the applicable window and you're ready to work on the geometry that's in that window. You want to switch to the next, you just switch over and you're ready to work. There's no activation that's necessary. In Creo 4, a really nice capability is the full screen mode. So in full screen mode, your model tree, ribbon, and message area disappear, and Creo encompasses your entire screen real estate. That allows you to work on the model and gives you full access to every inch of screen that you have. When you move your cursor over to where the model tree should be or normally is, it simply expands, shows up on the screen. You can do what you have to do. If you move your cursor off of the model tree, it then disappears again. Same is true with the ribbon or the message area. If you want to toggle between full screen and not full screen, you can use the icon or you can just press F11 and it toggles full screen and not. The view dialog box is sort of a combination of the orientation dialog box and the perspective dialog box. rather than having two separate dialog boxes, they basically join them together and put the various functionality into tabs within that dialog box. To access it, you simply, in the In-Graphics toolbar, click Saved Orientations and then Reorient, and that opens the View dialog box, and you can do things like reorient your model, save it as a specific orientation, access existing saved orientations, etc. A nice new function is View Normal. So at any point, you can select View Normal and select a surface, and that surface becomes parallel with your screen. So that way you don't have to have a saved orientation, say, you know, front, top, left, right, etc., or some other saved orientation so that you can orient your model into 2D. You simply click View Normal, select the surface, and your model will reorient. You can also select an edge to do that, and the edge will be aligned sort of into and out of your monitor. And we'll take a look at that when I do the live demonstration. With the model tree, there's an auto locate function. So when I select an entity on the screen, the system will highlight in the model tree the feature to which that entity belongs. So in the example I'm showing here, I've selected a surface of a chamfer, and the chamfer itself highlights in the model tree. So if you have a really complicated model, that's a nice way to figure out just what feature that geometry belongs to. If you don't care for that, you can certainly shut it off by clicking Show in the model tree and then disabling Auto Locate in Tree. If it's disabled and you're working in the model and you do, in fact, want to see where that feature exists in the model tree, then you can just right-click it and select Locate in Model Tree, and it'll highlight for you. One of the biggest updates here to Creo 4 is the mini toolbar. And this functionality is designed, well, for two reasons. One, it's great when you do have the screen in full screen mode and you don't immediately have access to the ribbon, but also simply for efficiency. I can select an entity, and common commands that are applicable to that entity will display in the mini toolbar. So in this example, I've selected this surface. So things like hole, shell, offset, etc. appear in that middle area of the mini toolbar. And then functions that would apply to the parent feature of that geometry display in the top row. So editing dimensions, edit definition, edit references, etc. The smart filter has been replaced with a geometry filter. A lot of the functionality is essentially the same, but it allows you to go in and limit your selections within your geometry. So for example, if I have the geometry filter set to its default geometry, I can select anything. I can select edges, surfaces, datums, curves, etc. But I may be creating a whole bunch of rounds, and all I want to be able to do for a little while is select edges. So I can set my geometry filter to edge, and edges are the only geometry type that I can select. If you do have that set and you want to sort of turn it off, then you can press and hold Alt, and that temporarily sets the filter back to geometry, and you can select whatever you'd like. So with the new selection paradigm here, PTC has come up with this idea of extended context. So what that means is if I select, say, an axis, the system will also provide me access to the feature that owns that geometry. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, in this case, if I select the axis, I can, in that mini toolbar, apply functions that would apply to that axis. So maybe I want to use it as a reference for a datum plane, or I can immediately have access to the parent feature to do things like edit dimensions, edit definition, and so on. To very quickly zoom in on an entity or an object, I can simply select it, and then in the mini toolbar, click Zoom Selected, and the system automatically zooms me in to an appropriate distance so that I can see that area of the geometry a little bit better, and I don't have to sort of move off of the model to work with my zoom functions. When you're selecting geometry, there's a 2D box selection, and how you select will dictate what you select. So in this example, we have our geometry filter set to edge. So the only thing I'm going to be able to select are edges. If I click from left to right, entities that are completely encompassed by that rectangle will be selected. If I click from right to left, which is what we're showing in this image, then any entities that are found inside that box will be selected, as well as any entities that the box crosses. So in this case, the box crosses this vertical line here that I'm showing with my mouse. That line will also be included in the selection. If I had selected the other way, it wouldn't have been included. There's nothing sort of magical about this selection. It's the same idea as if you had gone in and selected all of these together while holding, say, Control or Shift. So if I have something that's been selected in this 2D box selection and I don't want it anymore, just press Control and select it, and it's removed from your, in this case, chain of edges. Next, we're going to look at some of the part enhancements. So the depth options have been enhanced. Again, a lot of the things that you'll see in Creo 4 are designed, they're not necessarily new functions, it's just to make your life easier. So if I want to, I create, in this case, an extruded feature, and I want that to actually be on both sides of the sketching plane, I no longer have to go up to the dashboard to do that. I can simply right-click on the drag handle, move down to other side, and then select my side 2 depth options. There's a really nice new function for removing material when you're creating cuts, basically. You can right-click and select Remove Material, which will turn it essentially into a cut. And then there's a new option, 2 sides through all. So instead of having to go up into the Options panel and select through all for side 1 and side 2, it just sets that automatically, and you create a cut that extrudes both sides of the sketch plane through all. Another really nice tool that keeps you from having to create sort of intermediate construction geometry is the ability to, when using the both sides functionality, enter a negative offset. So in this case, you would create this feature, both sides of the sketching plane, and it's offset 50 in both directions. I can take, either by dragging or editing the dimensions, one side of this and drag it to the opposing side of the sketch plane. So now, although I'm using a both sides feature, it's created only on one side of the sketching plane. And I can use, as I said, either drag it or a negative offset to establish that. Again, the value here is, in order for me to create this feature that's in the lower image, generally I would have to create some sort of intermediate geometry, maybe a datum plane, and then I project the sketch onto it, and then I use that to create a feature. I don't have to do that anymore. I can simply drag it or enter a negative offset. With that same theme, I can also control my offsets when I use the ToSelected option. So in this case, I've created an extruded feature, and I want it to run up to this green surface. When I do that, it will take on, of course, the angle of that green surface, and my geometry is created. But what if what I really want is to have that extend beyond the green surface, but again, maintain the angle of that green surface? Well, I can use offset or transform to achieve that, and those are in the options panel in the dashboard. What the difference between offset and transform, ultimately you're achieving the same thing. The difference is in how the offset is measured. With offset, it's measured normal to the surface, the to-selected surface. Transform measures it along the extruded distance, length. There's been also enhancements to thicken. So if I wanted to create a revolve that connects the top gray geometry to the bottom gray geometry, I could sketch just a single line and revolve that, and then use thicken to add a thickness to it. What I can now do is use the cap with model geometry option, and I can then blend that geometry into the surrounding geometry if it's available. And we'll take a look at that when I do the demonstration as well. The datum plane's been enhanced to provide a mid-plane option. So with the mid-plane option, you can use two references and create a plane that runs at the midplane of those two references. Those two references may intersect, as I've shown in this example, but they don't have to. And I'll show you when I do the demonstration an example of where we use the midplane, but the features that we use as references don't actually intersect one another. And the last sort of part enhancement is enhancements to holes. So when I create a hole that's on a cylindrical surface, in previous releases of Creo, that hole is always created perpendicular to the surface itself, which is what we're showing on the left-hand side here. I now have the ability to access a hole orientation and select a reference that drives that hole not perpendicular, but either parallel or normal to my selected reference. So in the geometry I had, in this case, I had this axis that existed in the geometry. I created my hole on the cylindrical surface. It cuts through perpendicular to that surface, but I can then use that axis reference and it reorients my hole so that it follows that reference. In this particular example, the axis happens to follow or run through the center of the hole. It doesn't have to. I can use a reference from anywhere else. I could use this edge, for example, as my orientation reference. And the final update to holes, which is fantastic, is the addition of the top clearance option. This is an option that's enabled by default. When I do the demonstration, I have it disabled just so you can see exactly how it works. But if I were to create a hole on this green surface in the upper image, and that hole happened to be blocked on this side by this existing geometry, I'm going to get this result where I have this extra geometry that I don't really want. In previous releases, I'd have to find a way to cut that away and get rid of it. With the top clearance option, if there's adjacent geometry that interferes with the hole, the system will automatically blow that away. So we'll take a look at how that works as well. Finally, we'll look at Sketcher enhancements. I'll quickly preview that. So there's a new function in Sketcher called Clip Model. If I'm creating this geometry on this surface here, when I look at that in 2D, I see all of this other existing geometry, these holes on the right-hand side, any edges, I will see that. And even if I put it into hidden line form, hidden line view rather, it's just as confusing or more confusing because I see all of this extraneous information. I also run the risk of selecting things as references that I really don't want as references. So I can use the clip model option to cut away, and the system just does this for me, cut away anything that is between my viewing of the sketch plane and the sketch plane. So it simplifies what I'm looking at and helps me to complete my sketches and make sure I'm selecting the references that I want to select. In Sketcher, you'll also find the same 2D box selection that you find in part mode. So again, left to right, you'll select entities inside the selection rectangle. right to left, you'll select entities inside of and crossed by the selection rectangle. The shortcut menus in Sketcher have been updated. Again, Sketcher has its own little mini toolbar, so lock, strengthen, replace, etc. Those functions are added to the mini toolbar, and you'll find within Creo overall, the mini toolbar concept has been set up everywhere. Another nice little capability in Sketcher is the ability to set the line thickness of what you're sketching. This is purely visual. It's only so that you as the designer can kind of see a little bit more clearly what you've sketched. It has nothing obviously to do with the resulting geometry, but it is a nice little tool. You can set it from 1, which is the default, to 3, and it just controls the thickness of those sketched entities. Sketch references. So, over the years, we've all been taught typically to select your sketch references before you start sketching so that when you're sketching, your geometry snaps to those references. That's not, it's still not a bad idea to do that, but it's not necessary anymore. As you're sketching, if you cursor over an existing geometric entity, the system will snap to that entity. And it provides you 2 things. In this case, I've placed my cursor over a horizontal edge. The system provides me a midpoint I could snap to, either end point I could snap to, or I can just move my cursor to any location along that edge and it snaps to it. And when I select that entity, it's immediately turned into a Sketcher reference. So obviously, watch out for parent-child relationships and that sort of thing, but you don't have to select those Sketcher references beforehand. Once you've sketched a little bit of geometry, another little tool that will help you to sort of line things up and keep your sketches, especially if they're complicated, from getting out of hand, is this concept of alignment guides. So I've sketched this green line. I move my cursor over, and as soon as it becomes lined up with the end point of that line, I see this little dashed line that indicates that that is in alignment with the other geometry. So I could start more of my sketch here, work through it, and then come back and connect these 2 points as I saw fit later. 2 things that you'll notice about Sketcher, again, purely visual, but closed sections now have this pink or magenta color as opposed to the orange that they were before. And your sketched constraints are now actual icons. They're not just the little letters, T for tangent, H for horizontal, for example. They're actually little icons that just sort of more clearly define the sketch constraints that are there. Functionally, exactly the same, but just a visual change. So I'm going to switch over now to do a live demo and go through. These are sort of excerpts from the exercises that we have in our standard course. Karine, is Creo showing up on the screen okay?
Yes, it is, Scott. Everything looks good. I can see your mouse moving there, too.
Okay. I'll try not to go too fast because sometimes it gets a little funky, but I'll do my best here. So as we discussed earlier, just sort of a general change to the look of Creo. Still has the ribbon, still has the model tree, just a change to the color scheme and what have you. If we want to set this to full screen, and again, Karine, please let me know if this works where we're sharing here, but if I want to set this to full screen, in the lower left corner, there's a full screen toggle. I can hit that, and that sets my Creo parametric to full screen. Are you seeing that okay, Karine?
Yes, that looks good.
Oh.
You're breaking up a little bit, but for your voice, I'm not sure what we can do to prevent that right now, but
okay.
The screen looks good.
Okay.
So
okay.
we can still hear you, so you're good.
Sure. Okay, so as you see, it takes up the full screen. The ribbon, model tree, message area have all been removed, but if I want to access them, I just move my cursor to the right location and they display. And I can select inside them and work on them as I normally would. To get back out of full screen, I just press F11 and it takes me out back to the regular Creo window. So I talked about the mini toolbar. So let's say I want to create a round. I can select this edge, and right away inside my mini toolbar, without having to travel up to the ribbon, I can select round, and the geometry is created. And I can select additional edges to add to that round, and the feature is created. So the mini toolbar is just a big time saver in terms of mouse travel. If I select this surface, the mini toolbar shows up and it gives me options that would apply to a surface, right? So extrude, revolve, hole, shell. If I select an edge, it gives me options that apply to an edge. So round, chamfer, sweep, etc. So there's intelligence built into it, and it is a huge time saver. You can also customize that. Again, we talk about that in the full course, but don't have time to go through it here. So when I select an entity on the model, sorry, I already turned this off here. When I select an entity in the model, you see that it highlights in the model tree. When I turn that off, auto locate in tree, then when I make a selection, it doesn't highlight. However, I can right click, select it first, and select locate in model tree, and then it highlights. So if I want to, say, delete this round, I can select it. I can right click, so my right click options are still available, and I can delete that round. Just to reiterate, that mini toolbar is not a right click, it's a left click. When I select something with the left mouse button, that's when the mini toolbar shows up. However, even if I do right click, I get both the mini toolbar and the standard right click options. So let's look then at selection. So I want to select some edges. So I can select my geometry filter to edge. When I do, the only thing that I can select are edges. Select that, set that back to geometry, and I'm able to select anything, edges, surfaces, etc. So if I select this surface, I can click on View Normal, and you'll notice that that oriented the model based on that surface being parallel to my screen. So now I want to select some additional edges. So I can click Edge, and I'm going to do a click and drag. So I drag from right to left. That selects all of the entities that were inside of that rectangle, plus any entities that were crossed by that rectangle. If I want to go back to 2D, again, I can, in this case, use an edge as my view normal reference. If I select from left to right, only those entities that were completely encompassed by the box are the entities that are selected. And I can, of course, add additional references here. By pressing and holding Control, I can remove references that were selected by holding Control. And when I let go of Control, my mini toolbar shows up and I can add around to those edges. So nice, efficient way of working with the software, reducing that mouse travel to the top of the screen to get to your ribbon. So let's say I have another model open. Again, in previous releases of Creo, to work on one model and then the other model, I would have to go to that window and activate it. I don't have to do that anymore. So now I have the assembly open. You can see at the top that it's active. For me to go and now work on that other part, I simply click the window and I can work on it and do whatever I want to do. So go back to the assembly here. So I had discussed the View dialog box. So in the In-Graphics toolbar, I click Saved Orientation and Reorient. And now instead of the Orientations dialog box, I have this View dialog box. Functionally, the Orientation tab is the same. So I can select, a surface to face to the front and maybe this edge to face to the top, and that reorients the model. And I can zoom in on it, save it as a name, and then that name that I saved is now available in the In-Graphics toolbar. The other tab within the View tab is the Perspective tab, which allows you to change from orthographic to perspective orientation. We'll set it back to orthographic here. So they just took two dialog boxes, combined them into one. Okay, so we'll take a look now at the sketched feature enhancements. So we'll open up this model here. So in this model, there is a sketch. I want to use that sketch to create an extrusion. So I can select it in the model tree. And again, your mini toolbar is available both in the model tree and in the geometry. So I select it and I click Extrude. I didn't have to do anything else with that other than select it, hit Extrude, and my geometry has begun creation for me. I want to set this to both sides. So, previously I'd have to go up to Options and set my side 2 options here. Directly in the model, I can right-click on the drag handle, other side, blind, and now it's a both sides feature. If I want to have that geometry run up to this angled surface over here, I can right-click, select to selected, and select the angled surface, and that feature now runs up to that selected surface. If I want to offset that, though, so that it extends beyond, I can set my option here to either offset, where the offset is measured normal to the angle, or I can choose translate, where the offset is measured along the length of the extrude. And this can be both positive and negative in terms of distance. The other thing that we can do, as I mentioned earlier, is we can have a both sides feature where the geometry is actually created only on one side of the sketch plane. So rather than having to create some intermediate sketch geometry, I have the ability to simply drag that or enter a value and create my geometry. I may also want to turn this from an extrude into a cut. And I'll first this to blind. I may want to change this from an extrude to a cut. So all I have to do is just right-click, select Remove Material. And if I want this to extend all the way through the geometry in both directions, then I can right-click this and select two sides through all, and it creates the geometry cut through both sides. Nice and quick. I don't have to go up to my options panel and set these things manually. The system just takes care of that for me. Now with this geometry created, maybe I want to mirror this. And I want it mirrored such that the mirror plane is located directly between this surface and this surface. So I can select my extrude, I can mirror it, and I can create a datum plane. And my references for that plane will be this surface, all right, and this surface. And immediately, the system sets that to mid-plane and parallel to the adjacent surface, which is exactly what I want. So I click OK, resume my creation and complete the feature, and the feature is mirrored about that plane. So the mid-plane option can be at the intersection of geometry, or it can be at a location between geometric references. Let's take a look now at the thicken options. So we have this geometry, we have a sketch already created, and it's just this thin line here that connects the two features. So I want to turn that into a revolved feature. So I select it in the mini toolbar, I click revolve, and the system is looking for an axis. So I can turn the axis on, select my axis of rotation, and I can set that, oh, I don't think it took, there we go. And I can set this now to a solid, because by default it will turn it into a surface. Set it to a solid, rotate it 180 degrees so you can see what's happening, and make it a thickened feature with a thickness of 1. So take a look now at this from the back side. So as you can see, if we go to the Options tab, the Cap with Model Geometry option is selected by default. So if I zoom in here, we can see that it uses the adjacent geometry and it just merges with it. If I turn that Cap with Model Geometry option off, this is what you would get in Creo 3 or before. It doesn't merge with the adjacent geometry. In addition, where there's more than one potential merge, if we look at the other end, we have a next option. So I can actually tell this geometry, instead of using the top surface here as your surface to merge with, go to the next option, which is the side geometry here, and merges with it. Complete it, and my geometry is set. So nice way to cap off that geometry without having to make any additional features. Finally, with the part updates, we'll take a look at creating holes. So the first thing we'll look at is the top clearance option. So let me just turn on datum points, and it's going to be almost impossible for you to see over the web here, but there's a datum point that was created here, and I'm going to use that as a placement reference for my hole. So I can select the surface, and when I do, my options come up in the mini toolbar, so I select hole, and I can drag the center of that down to my datum point, and it creates the hole. We'll make that through all. And as you can see, the hole is created, but it's blocked off by this existing geometry, which, you know, it makes sense, right? You're creating the hole is unidirectional, it starts on the surface, it cuts through. But we don't really want that. What we want is for it to blast through on this other side as well. So we just, in the shape panel, we enable top clearance, and that just cuts it through. Nothing else that we have to do to make that happen. As I said, top clearance enabled is the default option. I just turned it off for the purposes of this exercise. So now we want to create another hole, and this hole is going to be located on these angular, or cylindrical rather, surfaces. So I'm going to create a hole, I'll select the surface, and I'll select this point, and that does what you would expect. It creates the hole perpendicular to this outside surface. But what if what I really want is the hole to be located here, but I actually want it to run directly through the surface parallel to this axis? Then all I have to do is I can either do the right-click and do Hole Orientation Reference Collector, or in the placement panel, click Hole Orientation, select the axis, and the hole is now aligned, or I shouldn't even say aligned, is parallel with that axis. As I mentioned earlier, that reference doesn't have to be in any way in contact with the hole. So I could, instead of using that axis, use this one, and I get exactly the same result. You'll notice, of course, that the top, after I changed it from being perpendicular to running parallel to this axis, we still have that top clearance issue. I can just right-click, top clearance, and now the hole cuts through. So some really nice capabilities that have been added there. Okay, so the final piece that I wanted to look at today was Sketcher. So we'll close this and open up the last model. So I want to create some geometry that starts on this surface that I'm highlighting, and maybe it runs across and it connects to this surface over here. In terms of the geometry, we have a cut on this side, and we have these cuts or hole features over here. So when I go and I want to create my geometry on this surface, I select it, select Extrude from the mini toolbar, and I'm ready to sketch. When I click Sketch View for 2D, I still see all of this geometry that's in front of my sketch plane, so these holes, these edges, etc. And even if I set the display to, say, hidden line, although I can now see through the model, I still see this geometry that's in the way. I can use the Clip Model option to cut away all of that geometry. So the system, this is my sketch plane. Anything that's between me as the designer and that sketch plane is removed from display. We can go back to Sketch View, and we'll set it just so we can see what's happening on the other side to hidden line. So the design that I'm working on, what it wants me to do is to create some geometry that actually uses this underlying cut as a reference and is, symmetric about it and what have you. So I could go in and I could set my Sketcher references and select some of this existing geometry, but I don't have to do that anymore. Let's say I want to create a center line, and I want that center line to be at the center of this horizontal line for this cut. So I can click center line, and the system automatically, when I go over this existing geometry, highlights it for me. It snaps to the geometry, and it shows me these three handles. I could snap to the end, the middle, or the other end. In this case, I'm going to snap to the middle and create my center line. What is nice about this is that now makes this other geometry a sketch reference. I didn't have to do anything manually about that. So now if I want to sketch some geometry, I can sketch my first line. The system snaps it to symmetric about that center line. And then I can click to create it, and then I keep going with my sketch. And normally you would sort of keep this as a chain, but I want to illustrate something, so I'll stop here and then begin a new line. So I sketched that horizontal line. As I move my cursor towards horizontal with that line, it snaps. And this may not come across to you very well, but there's a little tiny dotted line that shows me that it's an alignment point with that existing geometry. It doesn't do that with existing solid geometry. It does that with existing sketched geometry. And that would be so that I could come over here, I could start creating some more geometry, and then maybe later on come back and connect those two, and I wouldn't have to worry about manually aligning them later, right? It'll already be snapped to the right location. So I can continue to create my sketch. Again, as I come through, it will snap to existing geometry if I want it to, or the extended references here. Continue, go across, creates it symmetric, completes the geometry. When I've created my sketch, and it's an enclosed sketch, it highlights in pink as enclosed, and my references appear. So I have references for symmetric and horizontal, points on entity, etc. You can hover over any of those, and it will tell you what the constraint is. You can select them to delete anything that you could do with the previous versions. Only difference being these are now symbols as opposed to the text, T for tangent, H for horizontal, etc. Once you have completed your sketch, you complete the geometry, and you're all done. So those were the highlights of the updates that I wanted to cover today. Again, you know, in our full course, which is a day course, we cover this as well as I said, sheet metal assembly and detailing. But we wanted to give you sort of a taste of what the updates are and what's available within the course. So, Corinne, I don't know if there's questions about any of that.
Just to clarify, we do sell the book. The book is $45 here online. And if you are looking to take a training class using the ASCENT courseware, then we would recommend RAN 3D, that you could go to them for the training. But if you are, you know, the book is great for self-taught users, or if you are tasked with, you know, teaching employees or colleagues at your office, or you know, however it is, then the book is ideal. We sell it in a printed version, printed format, plus also a digital ebook version. So really just depending on your preference and how you want to learn. It's all the same material in there. And we also have instructor tools for these as well. So if you are the instructor teaching this class, then you would really benefit from having these instructor tools. They give you all the answers to the questions within the guide, timing suggestions. It is really only, you know, if you're teaching as a course, and you could do it in a day, but it just, you know, gives you an idea as how long to spend on each section. And I believe this one also has the instructor overheads, which are the PowerPoint files, that's basically, right, PowerPoint presentation that you can use. So you don't really have to do any work if you're teaching the course. It's all done for you. So you've got a slide here. Yep, this is great. These are all of the current titles that ASCENT has for the Creo 4.0.
Yeah, some of these are still in development, but these are what we will have coming up very soon.
Okay, perfect. Yes, I'm just looking here at the website to see. Yeah, we've got maybe, I think, 5 titles right now, but you're busy. You're working on the rest of them.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, and do we have a final slide there we can just share with everyone with our contact information? Oh,
yeah, so this was,
touched on. I don't know if you wanted to add anything else to that.
No, I think you covered it all. So, you know, as we said, we obviously run the classes. You can buy the books. The instructor tools are beneficial if you are teaching the class. And I think you covered all the various forms that these come in.
Yep. And this is our contact information here. So we do have our website, which is actually at the bottom there beside the blog, ascented.com. That's where you can go online, either there or the ASCENT eStore or Amazon, to buy the books. So we're kind of all over the place, which is great.